Nobody likes to talk about money, but it's something God's word says a lot about. You see, our world has one idea, and it's not always the best. Today we look at what does God say about our money and how we should use it. Let's check it out. Well, today we're continuing on in our series, Marriage, Money, and Minions. And I didn't get to be here last week because I was out actually preaching at our surprise campus, which was a lot of fun, but I missed your faces. So if your spouse or nobody else in your life said they missed your face, well, I missed your face, okay? Maybe you don't hear that enough, that your face is missed. But Scott did an incredible job kind of wrapping up the first of our topics in these series of marriage. And I want to say that was hard, wasn't it, right? I don't know about you, but talking about marriage isn't always fun. And talking about conflict in marriage really is not fun. And then going and having conflict in your marriage is even less fun, right? But if we want to make it more fun, then we shouldn't talk next about money. Because I don't know about you, money might be more comfortable to talk about than marriage, okay? Money is that topic that when you hear, you're like, right? It's the one that churches don't really like to talk about, that couples often fight about, that parents feel like they have nothing of, right? Because kids are so expensive. That governments never seem to run out of. They just print more, right? It's nice. And you probably wish you had a little bit more of, if you're honest, in some ways. But today, as we dive into this idea of marriage, we're going to see a few things and why this is so important, and how important it is also to some of these other topics we're talking about in this series. For example, we talked a lot about marriage, and when you look at money, and there's probably more root causes to this, but a third of divorces list the reason they get divorced as money. Whether that's money issues, that they have too much, that they don't have enough, that they don't want to agree on how to spend it, is it can become a strife in there. But our world has a lot to say about it, but I don't know if it's always the right thing to say about it. And actually, when we dive into our Bibles, the amazing thing is Scripture talks a whole lot about money. If you reference kind of all throughout Scripture, money or possessions is referenced over 2,300 times. When you look at just the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the life and the teachings of Jesus, he taught about money more than anything else. Actually, money is referenced more than, let me get this right, is referenced more than love, heaven, and hell combined in Jesus' teachings. And you see, as we dive into this, we're going to see one of those gospel lessons from Jesus about money. And here's where I want us to start. And here's going to be our key thought this morning that we're going to kind of launch off of. And I think what we're going to learn from our passage today, and it's going to sound a little weird, so I'm just going to kind of pre-warn you here. But it is this, and you can find these on our notes. You can kind of write this as you're going along, is we can make friends with our money, or we can make friends from our money. Now you hear that and you're like, maybe you need to read that a few more times. I'll say it one more time. We can make friends with our money, or we can make friends from our money. And on first time hearing that, you might say, like, those both sound bad, okay? Like, I read it like 10 times before I actually understood what I was reading. And like our leadership team, we're talking through this and we're like, hey, this is a truth that we get from Jesus. And we're like, wait, is this right? Like, what is the good one? Which is the bad one? I'm confused. They both sound bad. But I promise this is actually something that Jesus teaches us. And let me ask it, I'll ask it this way and see if it makes more sense. Is, do you want your friend to be money, or do you want to use your money to make friends? Again, you're probably thinking like, neither. Am I buying friends? Like, maybe in a way you don't understand, okay? You're like, I don't want to buy friends. Like, that sounds terrible. I can't make friends of my own, so I have to give them money so they like me. No, that's not what we're saying here. But this is the central theme we're going to work on. And this is the question I want us to ask and spend some time answering, is how do we make friends from our money? How do we use our money to make friends? Well, luckily, Jesus tells us. If you have your Bible, go and flip to Luke chapter 16. And in Luke chapter 16, we're going to look at a parable, a story that Jesus tells us where he is going to teach kind of a lesson. And there's a good chance that you've probably never read this parable. Maybe you've never heard it, or you haven't even like read all of it. Like you think you kind of read it really fast, like in a devotional, or you like listened to it and then you just skipped it because it said something weird and like, you're like, that doesn't sound right. I'm just going to keep going because I don't understand it. And there's a good chance you've never dived into this passage. But there's some interesting things that we are going to see in this story. And as I think we mine the depths of it, we're going to see Jesus isn't just saying, go buy a lot of friends with our money. But he's going to say, how do we use it in a biblical fashion that is so foreign to our world? And it all starts with how we need to steward it faithfully. Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 1, it says this, now he said, being Jesus, to the disciples, there was a rich man who received an accusation that his manager was squandering his possessions. So he called the manager in and he asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you can no longer be my manager. Then the manager said to himself, what will I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. Now we're going to stop right there and kind of like see this is the intro to this story and kind of sets up the initial problem with it. And this story has been named the parable of the dishonest manager. In most Bibles, it's going to say that. And then it starts with introducing us to a guy who didn't manage his boss's money well. Now, when you hear that, you're like, well, what does that mean? Like, this is a little different than kind of what we may think of today. Like, he wasn't necessarily his financial advisor, okay? So, like, when we think of money managers now, you think of, like my brother, for example, works for a financial firm, and he is my financial advisor, except he just puts them in robots, and they just do all the work, right? That's how it works nowadays. But this guy wasn't, like, investing his money in stocks. Like, he didn't just put it all in Bitcoin, it failed, and then he was broke. Instead, this guy was managing his money, like, literally day to day. And when it says he was dishonest, he wasn't just like putting it in risky stocks and it didn't quite work out. Instead, he was literally doing things. The word that is used here is he was squandering it, meaning he was literally wasting it or doing things that were unethical that didn't have any chance of return. He was using it selfishly for himself instead of using it as his master saw fit. So what does this have to do with us? Well, Jesus is making very clear at the start of it who each character is. In this story, the master represents God, and the dishonest managers represent us. And as we get into this, the manager or the steward had no money. That's the first thing we learn from this. He merely managed his boss's money. And in doing so in a moral and ethical way, he got to live off the generosity of his master. You see, the point of this is one of the most basic points of money that the Bible tells us, the most basic principle that your money is not yours. You've probably heard that before. And you were really quiet. You didn't even say amen on that. That means you didn't like it. So I'm going to say it again, and we'll get a redo to see if you're really believers in here, all right? Just kidding. But basic principle of money, right? Your money is not yours. There's some reluctance over here. Oh yeah, I gotta say amen, they said amen. All right. This is hard to grapple with, right? And I think especially like as I was writing this, I was like, man, I know this is true. I've preached this before. I'm gonna preach it again. But like I say it and it's easy to put lip service to it, but it's a lot harder to actually live out, especially in our culture and our society, right? We live in kind of this Western society and in America where we work hard for our money. Our government takes probably more than we want to, right? Or like, when the IRS comes, you're like, I don't want to give you anything. But like we still, work in a country of some freedom. So we get to work with our money. We get to build it. And so when we have it, we can be pretty greedy with it. We can be pretty prideful. I know I have that in my heart where I'm like, man, this is my house that I bought. This is my car. This is my TV. That really is my TV, okay? This is my entertainment that I've set up. I was like, this is mine. And then you read the Bible and God's like, bro, I just am letting you have it on loan, man. I'm letting you just use it out of the generosity, has the grace. And when we fail to recognize God's hand, we fail to recognize this basic biblical principle. And actually, this principle goes all the way back to the beginning of time. This idea of stewarding our money actually has roots and kind of in something that happens so early on in the Bible. And on each one of these points, we're going to kind of attach a little, I want to define a word and an action step for us, I think, to take today. And the first one we talk about stewarding our money is this all goes back to the holy mandate. And you'll see it on the screen. And I want to define this for you. Is what does that mean, that the holy mandate? And what does that have to do with stewarding my money? But it's exactly this, is it is the job of supervising or taking care of something, such as God's creation in gifts. Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, it says, the Lord took the man and he placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to watch over it. We just spent 8 months going through Genesis, right? That was a long time ago that we did Genesis 2. But it says God took the man and he placed him in the garden. Now think about the context, and we studied this before, is God created the garden. God created the animals. God created the plants. God created man, and then he put him there and he said, you work and watch over it. But man didn't do anything to create all that stuff. Man just got to live off the generosity of what God gave him. And that idea of the holy mandate has passed down to us when we talk about our money today, is our money isn't something that I worked for, I earned, I built my empire, I did this. It's like, no, God lets you have what you have now. C.S. Lewis describes it in kind of this idea of how we treat our money. And what's so funny is like when we earn that money and then when we're generous with that money, I think sometimes we can get even more prideful. Be like, look how much money I gave away, right? I am so generous. And C.S. Lewis compares it to the kid who buys a gift for their dad. But guess where that kid gets that money? From dad. And maybe you've been there and you open that present from your kid and you're like, oh, just what I wanted. You're like, I paid for this? Really? Like, what? And that's how we are with God. We're like, God, aren't you so impressed? Aren't you so impressed with the gifts I give you? C.S. Lewis's quote in this says, he, being God, should really be impressed with me giving him his money back. We can all fall into that trap of thinking things are ours when really at the end of the day, it is just us being able to steward God's money. And the first step of how do we make friends from our money, not with our money, I almost messed up there, but from our money is we need to steward it faithfully. But it continues in how we also need to secure it shrewdly. Let's keep reading in verse 4. It says, I know what I'll do. This is the dishonest manager talking. He says, I know what I'll do so that when I'm removed from management, people will welcome me into their homes. So he summoned each of his own master's debtors. How much do you owe my master? He asked the first one. 100 measures of olive oil, he said. Take your invoice, he told him. Sit down quickly and write 50. Next, he asked another, how much do you owe? 100 measures of wheat, he said. Take your invoice, he told him, and write 80. The master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd than the children of light in dealing with their own people. All right. I'm stumped, okay? How about you? This is the point of the story where you're like, wait, what? Like, what did Jesus say? Like, where did this story go? I'm so confused right now. First off, is we hear the word shrewd and we automatically think that means something bad, right? We obviously think that means something dishonest. That means something kind of deceitful. And that's not exactly what that word means. It's more of kind of quick-witted or kind of a creative solution here. But I also think we need some more context in this. Here's how, and there's a little bit of disagreements on here, but there's an overwhelming, and when we talk about kind of how these managers worked in this time, is similar to kind of how tax collectors worked. Is they made their wage by collecting debts for their master on behalf of their master. But what they would do is say you owed 80 shekels or whatever it is, or wheat, they would then do 100. And guess what that other 20 happens? You would think they wouldn't give that to their master? No, that went straight to their pocket. So these managers would go and collect these debts, and then they would skim off the top and they would charge more money than it was, so they would line their pockets. And so this is the context this is thrown in. So many commentators suggest that this guy then went back and he had given out these debts, these amounts that these people owed, and then he started lessening it to what they actually owed the master. And he was buying favor with these people. As they're like, man, he's giving me a discount. He's so generous. No other managers are acting this way. They thought this guy was so nice, was so awesome, when in the very first time he was actually doing ethical, honest business. That was so different than the world of that time. And the boss actually praises him for doing this. This leads to our next action step when we talk about this, is how do we respond to this? When we talk about, okay, we need to act, we secure our money shrewdly, maybe in a creative way, maybe in a different way. Well, here's what I want us to kind of link to this, is use this definition of how we should have our money and we should secure it in an honest way with honest work. Let me define this for you. This is the process of working for money in a way that is free from fraud or deception, that is legitimate, that is truthful in pointing to Christ. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 27. It says, the one who profits dishonestly troubles his household, but the one who hates bribes will live. You see, it can be really hard at times to kind of swim against the stream. And the stream of culture sometimes, and sometimes the stream of business practices, is you just do whatever you need to make the money. You do whatever you need to make the sale, right? Like nobody likes used car salesmen because you feel like they're lying to you the whole time, right? It's like, I'll do whatever I can to get ahead in my job, to get farther, to do this. Like you go get your car worked on and you're like, I need my oil change. And then they say your car's gonna blow up if you drive like away from right now, unless you drop $3,000, okay? And that's why we have good car guys in our church that I go and I'm like, hey, this is the list they gave me. They're like, yeah, none of that. You don't need to do any of it. It's great. But this is how our world works. But here's what I ask, and when we think about that, I think a question that goes with it, and when honest work, sometimes we're like, does that mean that we just let the world run ahead of us? Does that mean that we don't work hard? Does that mean that we don't learn? Does that mean that we don't sharpen our skills, that we don't just keep pushing and prying and be as successful as we can? Not at all. But sometimes we can actually even stand out more when we don't cut corners and we don't do things the wrong way. You know, God providentially has everything in his will. And when I was from 15 years old, felt called to ministry, I expected to just go to ministry straight away. But somehow it wasn't lining up that way. So I was like, well, let me get a degree, and I got a business degree. And then from there, I was like, had a job outside of college. Like, that's good, right? Like, it's good to have a job so I can get away and I can put money in the bank and I can have a family one day. So I went into the marketplace. I went into the corporate world and I was successful. And one of the things that I love that I will never forget is my boss told me one time, the guy who hired me, who's my boss's boss, who I still talk to, he said, there was just something different about you, that you just stood out. I wasn't smarter than most of my classmates and the people I came up with in that program. I might have been better looking. I don't know, that's here or there. But it was really nothing I did. It was literally Christ coming through me. It was literally me being patient and loving with people, even when I didn't want to be patient and loving with people. And it was not cutting corners, not throwing old Susie Q under the bus, but doing things the right way, caring about people. And man, I'm so thankful for that time and what God did in that area. And I think sometimes we buy into the lie of our world of you got to do this, you got to be ruthless, you got to be cutthroat, you got to follow X, Y, and Z to get ahead. And the truth is you don't. When you do things God's way, God will find a way to provide. Even if it's not on your timing, even if it doesn't look the same way you do, is when we are honest in our work, just as the Bible promotes, that God will open doors. You see, we need to manage our God-given money right. We need to work honestly, but we also need to spend it eternally. Let's keep reading in verse 9. And Jesus continues in this, and he says, and I tell you, this is him speaking to his disciples. He says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of worldly wealth, so that when it fails, they may welcome you into eternal dwellings. Whoever is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And whoever is unrighteous in very little is also unrighteous in much. So if you have not been faithful with your worldly wealth, who will trust you with what is genuine? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to someone else, who will give you what is your own? Verse 9 is the start of how we kind of developed this key thought that we started with today, where it's one of those things like that we said before, like Jesus actually said that? Because that sounds weird. That doesn't sound like something Jesus would say. But listen again what he says. He says, make friends by means of worldly wealth. He says, use your money to make friends. And you're like, Jesus, really? Like that's just like so weird. Like why would you say that? Like it's not something we expect him to say. But let's break it down a little bit. Because what he doesn't mean is buy your friends. I go to conferences every now and then, and I've gone to conferences like Marketplace and even church conference. And the people that are the big deals, or that sometimes think they're a big deal or whatever, it's funny how they travel in an entourage. Okay, there's like people around them and they're like gathered. And I'm like, I just want to rent an entourage one day and just walk around and see if it makes me feel any cooler, right? And it's like when you see that entourage around, you're like, oh, like what is happening over there? And I bet most like, when you get famous and stuff, like you have an entourage because you have money and they want your money. So you like buy your entourage. They don't actually like you. They just want what you have. But it's like traveling around. And Jesus is saying like, hey, that just means you need to use your wealth to attract a lot of people, to be around you and to have fun? Not at all. But instead, what he's talking about is we see our money as being an investment into our relationships. That we see our money as a means and as a method to help and to love people. And as verse 9 continues, I love this, that Jesus tells us that our money is going to fail. Right? He says so that when it fails. He doesn't say if it fails, but he says when your money fails. Because worldly wealth will fail at some point or another. You cannot take it with you past the grave, okay? It will fail. But when we are investing in it generously to other people, we are making an investment that allows us to speak eternal truth into them. You see, are you spending your money on what you and others need and what can help them? Or are you spending money to just build your own kingdom, to fill your own needs, to fill your own wants, and just to fill up the satisfaction in yourself? You see, I think all of our spending habits, kind of the root cause when we go to and why we spend the money that we do is it goes to where is our heart at and what is actually in there that we need fulfillment of. Which brings us to our action step up to this, that how do we counter that? How do we spend our money the right way? Is we have to have heavenly fulfillment. Let me define this for you, and it's up on the screen ahead of me. The heavenly fulfillment is the meeting of a requirement or condition, reaching full contentment of our eternal longing. You might be tired if you've been in our church for a while because I say this verse probably way too much, but I love it because it shares the gospel so much. But Ecclesiastes 3:11 talks about this. That says that he has made everything beautiful in its time, talking about God. But it says, but yet he has set eternity in the hearts of men, and they cannot fathom what he has done from beginning to end. You see, when God created us, he put an eternal-sized hole inside our lives, an eternal-sized hole inside our heart. And here's what we do, especially as Americans, is we think, hey, that TV, that can fill that hole. That car, that can fill it. That new house that I'm looking at Redfin and Zillow about, once I get that, I'm gonna be happy, right? This new thing, that new it, and we spend and we spend and we spend and we spend. And here's the tricky part, is it fills it temporarily. For a little bit, it's pretty good. When I bought my current TV, it's a 70-inch, okay? And then I bought little lights around and stuff. It filled me up. 6 months later, I said, man, I should have gone 82. Regret it to this day. And then by the time I get an 82, I'll want a 95 or something like that. Or we'll just all have LED walls in our house. I don't know. But it can fill it temporarily. But it's only a matter of time before that just goes right down. And when we talk about this fulfillment in our lives, when we talk about how do we truly be fulfilled, it only happens when something eternal enters into our life. We will spend and spend to try to fill that. But when Christ is the one filling us, when God is the one bringing us contentment, it allows us to then spend our money on things that truly matter. So how do we spend our money eternally? Well, some of the things we talk about here. Some of the things are like sending kids to camp where they get to hear the gospel, where they get to hear and experience things. I was saved in a youth camp and it forever changed my life, right? I was saved in those, in sending that out, but it's also helping in your local communities. It's helping supporting people who need a meal. It's helping single moms cover rent. It's all those things. But here at Cross Church, I also want to introduce you and preview of a few ways we're going to do this intentionally as a church body over this next year. There are 3 offerings that kind of, when we talk about this, this is above and beyond your normal gifts that we are challenging our church body to adopt this year that is going to make kingdom causes push forward. The first one is around Easter time in the month of April. We're going to take a church planting offering. Where 100% of all the money we take in, we're going to put towards starting churches around our country. That's starting more churches for more people to hear the gospel, for more expansion to happen and for our kingdom and God's kingdom to grow bigger. Later on in the fall, we haven't set the date quite for that, is we're going to do a church rescue offering. In that church rescue offering, we're going to take money that we're going to invest back into churches who are failing or who have failed in these ways, and we're going to build them back up. Some of that money is actually going to go to helping start our Cross Church El Mirage, where we're taking a building that has died, that has been empty, and we're going to pour into it, and we're going to put that light back in that community. And then lastly, around Easter time, we're going to kind of have a church international, and we're going to have a missionary offering around Christmas time, where all that money is going to go to missionaries and international churches around the world. We're going to see the gospel continue to be spread. And here's why I say all of that is because we can spend our money on things we don't need. And then I'm preaching to myself just as much as everyone else, right? I am, like Paul says, the chief hypocrite here is we spend stuff on things we don't need when we can be generous and have eternal impacts with the money God gives us. And lastly, this leads to our final way we're going to talk about is how do we make friends from our money? Is we don't serve it ultimately. Look at verse 13. And I love how Jesus wraps this up and he actually says this in a few different places, but in verse 13 he says, "No servant can serve 2 masters. Since he will either hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and he will despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." You see, Jesus makes very clear here that money easily can become a god in our life. It can easily become an obstacle, an idol that stands in the gap between us and God. And just like we talked about this in week 1, right? When we talked about marriage, we talked about how the gift marriage is and how sex is a great gift inside that marriage that God has given us. But when it's abused, when it's misused, it becomes something that is destructive in our life. And money is the same way. God has given us money. It can lead to blessings. It can lead to amazing things that we can do in our world. But if we're not careful, it can also lead to division and hurt. And when we are confronted with this idea that it's an obstacle in our lives, it goes to asking the question of where is our heart? Is our last action step that we're going to kind of talk about in here today and define for you, is our heart priority? And I want to define it as this, is our heart priority is a thing that is regarded as more important than another, right? That's what a priority literally means. But when we talk about this in a spiritual context and in our live context, it's seeing God as more important than our money. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 21, Jesus is writing and he's preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, and he gets to this topic of money. And some of this is exactly what he says in Luke 16 here. But he says this, he says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." He compares this to the body that when he says, when the eye is healthy, you can see, but when that is sick, you're poisoned. And then in verse 24, he ends and he says, "No one can serve 2 masters." Sound familiar? When he says it twice, you know it's a big deal. He says, "Since you either hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." You see, money is a great thing. Money literally is a gift from God. He's given it to us to steward it, to secure it the right way, to spend it the right way, but more importantly, to make sure that we're not serving it, but we're using it to serve him. And when we come to this idea, when we come to this topic, my prayer is that there be some conviction in your life. That if there's some area that you are using your money in an incorrect place, or that it just has this priority that it shouldn't have, that you just ask God to take it away. Because money is a great resource, but I guarantee you it's not a good friend. And what would it look like if a group of people, if Christians all across our country, inside our church, inside our city, inside our country, and around our world, started to truly look at our money as a method to expand his kingdom and not our own?